They mocked her for being too poor, until the rich baron said, "My ranch needs a woman like you." The laughter always came from the same place. In the small town where everyone knew each other's business, the girl who wore patched dresses and carried baskets of wildflowers was an easy target. They called her names that clung to her like burrs, words meant to remind her of the walls she'd never step inside, the tables she'd never sit at, and the wealth she'd never taste. Yet she walked with her head held high, her hands steady, her heart unbroken. She tended to her mother's garden and gathered herbs from the hills, trading them for bread, oil, or thread. Her quiet strength was seen by few, but the earth itself seemed to lean toward her, as though it knew she carried more dignity than any mocking voice could strip away. The rich baron was a man apart, though the town lived in awe of his sprawling ranch on the edge of the horizon. His horses were said to run swifter than storms, his herd stretching across the land like a tide. Yet in his house of stone and polished wood, there was a silence no banquet could fill. He had wealth enough to buy the world's applause, but no laughter in his halls, no gentle hand to soften his days. He watched people more than they realized, his eyes lingering not on the loud or the proud, but on the ones who moved with purpose when no one applauded. And so, when the villagers mocked the girl in the marketplace, it was not their jeering that drew his attention, but her calm reply, the way she ignored them and instead helped an old woman lift her bundle, her voice warm, her smile unshaken. It was then that he approached, not with the arrogance they expected of a man of his standing, but with a simple truth: "My ranch needs a woman like you." The crowd fell silent, their ridicule turning into stunned whispers. The girl's eyes met his, uncertain, wary, yet unwavering. She had known offers wrapped in cruelty before, promises made only to humiliate her further. But this was different. His voice carried no mockery, no pity. It was a recognition, as if he had seen past her worn shoes and calloused hands and glimpsed something others could not. Days turned into weeks, and she found herself walking the lands of the ranch, her fingers brushing the golden grasses, her knowledge of soil and seed speaking louder than any formal schooling could. She taught the workers how to heal sick calves with herbs, how to coax blossoms from tired ground, how to treat every creature as if it bore a soul worth protecting. Under her care, the ranch did not just prosper, it breathed. Life flourished in ways coin could never purchase. The baron watched, not as a master lording over, but as a man who had finally found a partner equal to the weight of his world. The same voices that once mocked her now fell into silence, not from fear but from revelation. The girl who had been too poor for their company became the woman who stitched richness into every corner of the land she touched. Her laughter echoed in the halls that had long been quiet, her strength softened the hardest of days, and her love brought warmth where wealth had brought only cold abundance. What the baron had seen in her was not poverty, but treasure, the kind invisible to those who measure worth in gold. And in the stillness of dawn, as the sun rose over fields alive with color and sound, she stood beside him not as someone who had been chosen out of charity, but as someone who had been recognized, needed, and deeply valued. What once was mockery had become memory, faint and distant, while her presence had become the heart of a legacy that no laughter could tarnish. The mornings on the ranch carried a kind of music she had never known before. The rustle of wind through tall grasses, the low murmur of cattle moving as one, the rhythmic clatter of hooves against earth. It was not silence, but a symphony of life that woke her each day. She rose before the sun, as she always had in her mother's cottage, and walked out to the fields while the mist still lay like silver over the ground. The baron would sometimes watch her from the porch, his frame tall and still, his expression unreadable but his gaze never wavering. He had grown used to command, used to being obeyed, but in her he found someone who needed no instruction. She worked not because she was asked, but because it was in her blood, woven into the marrow of who she was. The workers, at first skeptical, had tried to measure her in glances and whispers. They had thought she was there to play at being important, another fleeting presence in the baron's world. But she bent her back as they did, carried water, tied fences, soothed frightened colts with a patience that stunned them into silence. She knew how to read the sky for storms, how to feel the shift of air that warned of rain or fire, how to touch the soil and know whether it hungered for rest or was ready to give again. Slowly, the men and women of the ranch came to her not with doubt but with questions, and when she answered, they listened. The baron himself found his world altered in ways he had not anticipated. He had spent years building wealth, measuring progress in land, herds, and numbers on ledgers. Yet in her presence, he began to see that prosperity was not only in what one owned but in how one lived. He noticed the way she lingered by a single dying plant, whispering to it as though it could hear her, coaxing it back to life with tenderness and care. He noticed how she gave her bread to a child of one of the workers, how she laughed easily though life had never been gentle to her, how she carried herself as though her worth had never been in question. It unsettled him at first, to see strength clothed in humility, but it also drew him closer to something he had long forgotten, the warmth of simple humanity. When she visited the town, the change in how people treated her was evident. Where once there had been sneers, now there was hesitation, even awe. Merchants who had ignored her before offered their best produce, eager to please the woman who now walked beside the baron. Yet she never accepted more than what was fair, never let their sudden reverence shift the balance of her heart. She knew their kindness was not born of newfound respect, but of fear of losing favor. So she kept her dealings plain and her manner unchanged, speaking to the baker with the same ease she once had when she bartered herbs for bread, smiling at the children who followed her with wide-eyed curiosity, and offering a quiet greeting to those who still could not meet her gaze. But the baron noticed something else too. At night, when the ranch quieted and the fires dimmed, she often sat alone, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes turned toward the hills where the stars rested low. He joined her once, asking what she saw in the dark. She answered softly, "The world is so wide, and yet people spend their days trying to make it small. They laugh at what they don't understand, they turn away from what they think is beneath them. But the land, it doesn't care who you are. It gives if you tend it, and it takes if you neglect it. I suppose that's why I always loved it. It treats us all the same." Her words stayed with him long after, echoing in places of his mind he rarely visited. He had grown accustomed to power's comfort, to walls and gates and the distance they created. Yet she seemed to belong not to barriers but to bridges, to the invisible lines that connected earth, sky, and soul. And as days grew into months, he realized he no longer wanted the ranch to be only a monument to his name. It was becoming a place of belonging, and that belonging was because of her. The first true test came when drought struck. The sky hardened into brass, the rivers shrank into dust, and the animals grew restless in the heat. Fear spread among the workers, for the land that had fed them now seemed intent on devouring itself. The baron, though seasoned in hardship, felt the weight pressing on his shoulders more heavily than ever. But it was she who steadied him. She walked the parched fields, touching the dry soil, her mind weaving through possibilities. She called upon knowledge her mother had taught her, of storing water in clay jars, of planting root vegetables that held moisture, of using herbs to keep the livestock healthy when the grass grew brittle. Together with the workers, she built a system of trenches to capture what little rain might fall, urging them not to despair but to fight alongside the earth rather than against it. Her voice was not commanding, yet it carried authority born of sincerity. Even in the suffocating heat, the workers found themselves fueled by her presence, unwilling to falter while she pressed on. And when the first thin rain finally returned, trickling into the trenches and soaking into the soil, it felt less like chance and more like the land itself had listened to her. The baron watched this transformation with a deep, quiet awe. He had once believed leadership was forged in power, in wealth, in the ability to command obedience. But she led by lifting, by giving, by reminding others of their own worth. He found himself asking questions he had never dared. What would it mean to live not only for himself, but for the lives his land touched? What would it mean to be remembered not for what he owned, but for what he nurtured? The seasons turned, and the ranch thrived again. Flowers bloomed where once there had been dust, calves grew strong under her careful tending, and the workers carried pride in their labor, knowing they were part of something greater than themselves. And in the quiet spaces between labor and rest, the bond between the baron and the woman deepened. They spoke not often of love, for neither was frivolous with words, but in the way he reached for her hand as they walked, in the way she leaned into him when evening winds grew cold, the truth was undeniable. Yet not all were pleased. In the town, whispers grew sharper. Some said she had bewitched him, others that he had lowered himself by choosing a woman with no name, no dowry, no standing. Old alliances began to shift, old grudges simmered to the surface. Invitations that once flowed freely to the baron slowed to a trickle, as the wealthy sought to remind him of where they believed his loyalties should lie. He, however, did not waver. When confronted, he said only, "I would rather share a table with one who brings life than 100 who bring vanity." His words, carried through the town like a wind, left no space for further challenge. Still, she felt the sting of their disdain, though she never let it show. One evening, as they walked the edge of the ranch beneath the sweep of twilight, she turned to him and said, "Do you not fear losing what you've built? For me, who came with nothing?" He stopped, looking at her as though the question itself were foreign. "What I fear," he answered, "is building walls so high that I cannot see the truth beyond them. And the truth is that you have given me more than wealth ever could. You've given me back myself." It was in that moment she understood that love, when rooted in respect, could withstand any storm. And so she stood by him, not as one who had been chosen out of pity or convenience, but as one who had been seen for who she truly was. Together they wove a new story for the land, a story where laughter returned to the halls, where workers felt pride in their craft, where children ran freely across fields that would one day be theirs to tend. Years would pass, and the girl once mocked for being too poor would become a figure the town could not forget. Not because she wore fine clothes or commanded riches, but because she had carried herself with unshaken dignity from the start. And in the ranch, now alive with the rhythm of seasons, her presence was everywhere, woven into the soil, the air, the very heart of the Baron who had once thought himself complete, only to discover he had been waiting for her all along. The horizon stretched endlessly, as it always had, but now it was no longer a reminder of what she lacked. It was a promise of what they could build together, something rooted not in gold, but in the unyielding strength of a woman who had once been mocked, and who had turned that laughter into the foundation of a legacy. The years were kind to them, though not always easy. Life on the ranch was never meant to be a gentle existence, but it was rich with meaning, filled with days that demanded labor and nights that gave rest in equal measure. When their first child was born, a daughter with eyes dark and steady like her mother's, the workers gathered with joy, bringing baskets of milk and bread, gifts made not of gold but of devotion. The Baron held the infant awkwardly at first, his hands more accustomed to reins and ledgers than to the fragile weight of new life. Yet when the child's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, his expression softened in a way that astonished even himself. The woman watched them together, her heart both tender and fierce. She knew what it was to be dismissed, to be told one's worth was measured in coin and appearance. She vowed her children would never feel the sting of that falsehood. They would grow knowing that strength was found not in titles, but in truth. So she raised her daughter with stories of the earth, teaching her how to plant seeds, how to tend animals, how to see beauty where others saw only struggle. And when their son came some years later, with a laugh that filled the house like sunlight, she gave him the same lessons, for in her eyes there was no difference in what boys and girls should know of dignity and labor. The Baron, too, changed under fatherhood. He had once lived as though his name alone were his legacy, but now he saw legacy written in smaller, quieter moments. He would ride with his daughter across the fields, showing her the far reaches of the ranch, not as a lord instructing an heir, but as a father sharing his world. With his son, he would kneel in the dirt, guiding his small hands to plant a sapling, speaking of patience and time, of how greatness was not in quick gains but in roots that held steady through storms. The man who had once thought wealth was measured in acres began to see it measured in laughter around the table, in shared meals, in evenings where his wife's voice told stories by the fire while their children listened with wide eyes. The town, though slow to change, could not remain untouched by this transformation. Merchants began to notice the ranch workers walked with more pride, spending their wages on goods for their families rather than surviving hand to mouth. The children of the workers were sent to learn letters, encouraged by the woman who had once been mocked for her lack of standing. She visited the schoolhouse often, bringing herbs and bread, telling stories of how every living thing had worth. The teacher, at first cautious, grew to admire her wisdom, and together they made learning something that belonged to all, not just the privileged few. But progress stirred resentment as well. Families who had once prided themselves on wealth alone found their influence waning. They whispered that the Baron's household was too open, too generous, that he risked diluting his power by aligning himself with those who had once been beneath him. One wealthy landowner in particular, a man named Corvin, held bitterness like a blade. He had expected the Baron to marry his daughter years before, uniting two powerful estates. That rejection still festered, and seeing the woman who had once carried baskets of wildflowers now standing where his daughter might have stood was a wound he would not let heal. Corvin began to spread rumors, subtle at first, then sharper. He claimed the woman's knowledge was witchcraft, that her herbs were unnatural, her influence dangerous. Though many dismissed him, enough listened to plant seeds of doubt. One evening, as she returned from the town with her daughter, she overheard two women speaking in hushed tones, wondering if her rise had been earned or stolen through cunning. She walked on without pause, but that night, as she watched her children sleep, the weight of old Mockery pressed upon her again. The Baron noticed her silence and asked what troubled her. She told him what she had heard, and he listened, his face darkening not with anger but with resolve. "Let them speak," he said quietly. "Their words cannot undo what is true. You have given life to this land in ways none of them ever could. No lie can erase that." His certainty steadied her, yet she knew words could wound as deeply as blades, especially when aimed at those unprepared to defend themselves. She resolved then to make her life an answer to every doubt, her deeds a shield stronger than rumor. And so she continued, pouring her spirit into the land and its people. When sickness spread through the cattle one winter, she spent long nights in the barns, tending each animal with remedies she crafted from roots and leaves. When storms tore through the ranch, she worked beside the men to rebuild fences, her hands raw and blistered, her resolve unbroken. And when the drought returned years later, fiercer than before, she rallied not only the ranch but the entire town, teaching them the same methods she had once used, urging them to unite rather than hoard. In time, even those who had whispered against her found themselves relying on her knowledge, their children fed because of her foresight. Her daughter grew into a young woman as steadfast as her mother, with the same dark eyes that saw beyond appearances. She rode with confidence, led with quiet strength, and when her father began to age, she took on more responsibility without hesitation. Suitors came, drawn not only by her beauty but by the legacy she carried. Yet she turned away those who sought her hand for wealth alone, waiting instead for someone who saw her as her father had once seen her mother, not as an ornament but as an equal. Her brother, though more restless, carried the same fire. He spoke often of traveling, of seeing the world beyond the ranch, yet he returned always to the soil that had shaped him, as though invisible threads bound him to the land his parents had nurtured. The Baron, in his later years, often sat beneath the great oak tree at the edge of the ranch, watching the fields stretch golden before him. His hair had turned white, his back bent, but his eyes still burned with the same clarity. He would take his wife's hand and say, "Do you see what we have built? Not the land, not the herds, but the life. They mocked you once, yet now they build their hopes on what you gave them. And I," his voice would falter, thick with unspoken gratitude. She would smile, her touch gentle, and answer, "We built it together." As the years rolled forward, the ranch became more than a home. It became a center of learning, a place where knowledge of the land was shared freely, where families who once had nothing found dignity in work and belonging. Travelers spoke of it as a place unlike any other, where the measure of a person was not in their wealth but in their willingness to tend, to care, to respect the earth and each other. The children grew into leaders, their own children carrying forward the same values, each generation rooted in the lesson first taught by a woman who had once been mocked for being too poor. That true richness lies not in gold, but in the courage to live with dignity, to give without counting the cost, to build where others seek only to take. And as time went on, the story of the girl with patched dresses and wildflowers became a kind of legend. Not the kind told in songs with exaggerated glory, but the kind whispered at night by mothers to children, a story of how one woman's quiet strength reshaped not only a ranch, not only a baron, but an entire way of life. For though wealth may build walls, it was her spirit that built bridges, and it was those bridges that endured, carrying her name long beyond her years, carried in the soil, the wind, and the unbroken laughter of generations. The night air on the ranch had always been her solace. Long after the lanterns in the workers' quarters dimmed and the cattle had settled into their slow-breathing rhythm, she would step outside, her shawl wrapped tight against the breeze, and listen. The land, even in darkness, had a pulse. She heard it in the creak of branches, in the soft rush of a creek hidden by tall grasses, in the distant cry of an owl. It was the same rhythm she had listened to as a child in her mother's cottage, the same rhythm that had sustained her when laughter had been her only companion. Now, however, the rhythm was no longer a private refuge. It was the heartbeat of a world she and the Baron had built together, one that would outlast them both. Their children had grown, and with growth came their own questions, their own struggles. The daughter, Elira, carried herself with the quiet authority of her mother, yet there was a fire beneath her calm that flared in unexpected ways. She questioned her father's decisions at times, not out of rebellion but from a desire to understand and to shape a future that stretched beyond his vision. When he spoke of expanding the ranch, she countered with concerns about overgrazing, about preserving the land for the generations yet to come. Their debates were spirited but respectful, and the Baron, though unused to challenge, found himself listening more closely each time. He saw in her not defiance but the echo of the woman he had once met in the marketplace, the girl who had refused to bow to Mockery. Their son, Cale, was different, restless, curious about the wider world. He often disappeared for weeks, traveling with caravans, learning from traders, watching how other towns lived and faltered. When he returned, he brought stories of faraway places, tales of kingdoms at war, of cities crumbling under greed, of communities thriving through unity. His mother listened intently, asking questions that cut through the glamour of his adventures. She reminded him that stories were not only for telling but for shaping choices. "What you see elsewhere," she said, "is not just spectacle. It is a lesson. Bring back not only what dazzles, but what endures." He carried her words with him, though the hunger for movement still burned in his bones. The workers on the ranch had long since ceased to think of themselves as merely laborers. They were families bound to the land by loyalty and pride, sharing in its growth and its struggles. Children ran freely across the fields, learning to ride almost before they could walk, their laughter ringing through the barns and pastures. When disputes arose, they were settled not by decree but by gathering, by listening to one another until resolution came. This was her influence. She had taught them that strength was not in division but in unity. The Baron, who had once commanded through fear of loss, now saw that leadership could rest upon trust. He marveled at how easily she had transformed not only him but all who touched her life. Yet even as harmony grew within the ranch, storms brewed beyond it. Corvin, the landowner who had once sought to bind his family's legacy with the Baron's, had not forgotten his grievance. Age had not softened him, bitterness had become his marrow. His own lands, poorly managed and driven by greed, began to falter. Workers deserted him, drawn to the steadiness and fairness of the ranch. Merchants turned to the Baron's household, knowing they would find honesty and coin there. Carvin's pride curdled into fury, and he whispered venom into the ears of those still willing to listen. He spoke of imbalance, of danger in one family holding such sway, of old traditions being overturned by a woman who had no rightful claim. Rumors spread, subtle at first, then louder. Whispers that the ranch was too powerful, that its prosperity threatened to choke the town. Some said the Baron had been bewitched, that his judgment was clouded by a woman who knew tricks of herbs and charms. Others grumbled that wealth should not be shared so freely with workers, that generosity weakened the noble bloodline. For the woman who had once endured laughter, the resurgence of disdain was a familiar wound. She bore it with the same dignity as before, but now she worried less for herself and more for her children, who would have to face these shadows in their own right. Elira, when she heard such whispers, confronted them with fire. If they fear strength born of fairness, she told her father, let them fear. Better that than to kneel to the rod of greed. Her words carried truth, but her mother cautioned her gently. Anger may win a moment, my daughter, but patience wins the years. Let them see through time what is true. Truth does not need defending as fiercely as you think. It endures without fire. Elira bit her tongue, though her eyes still burned with the sharpness of youth. Cale, upon returning from one of his journeys, brought darker news. In towns beyond their borders, unrest was rising. Men like Corvin, clinging to fading power, were banding together, seeking to reclaim control through force. He warned that envy and fear could unite even the weakest of foes into a dangerous tide. The Baron listened, his hand heavy upon his son's shoulder. He had grown older, slower, but his mind was still sharp. We will not answer fear with fear, he said. If they come with open hands, we will meet them. If they come with closed fists, then we will decide how to protect what is ours. But this land was built not on war, but on labor and love. That is our strength. It was not long after that Corvin made his move. He gathered allies, men who had lost lands through mismanagement or who hungered for what was not theirs. They came not with armies but with pressure, demanding higher taxes, claiming rights to the water that flowed through the ranch's lands, spreading lies of corruption and hoarding. The town council, swayed by their clamor, called the Baron to answer. He went, not as a supplicant but as a man who knew his worth. His wife stood beside him, her presence a reminder that his strength was not his alone. When Corvin leveled his accusations, the Baron did not shout. He simply spoke truth, calling upon the people of the town to bear witness. The workers, the merchants, the children who had grown strong on food from the ranch, all stood for him. Their voices drowned out the lies, their loyalty silencing the envious. Corvin left that hall defeated, yet not humbled. He returned to his estate and withdrew from public life, his bitterness festering until his name became a warning rather than a legacy. His family dwindled, his land swallowed by debt, his house crumbling. Where once he had sought to belittle the girl who became the Baron's wife, history reduced him to little more than a cautionary tale, of pride without substance, of envy without end. Meanwhile, the ranch continued to grow not just in size but in spirit. Generations began to weave themselves into its fabric. Elira married a man of strength and humility, a scholar who had come to study the ways of the land and had stayed for love of her fire. Together, they raised children who knew both the weight of books and the weight of earth, their minds sharp, their hands skilled. Cale, after many journeys, found his heart tethered at last to a woman he met in a distant town, one who shared his hunger for knowledge but also his respect for roots. He returned to the ranch with her, not to settle permanently but to ensure his children knew the soil that had shaped him. His wanderlust remained, but always he came back, as though the land itself called him home. The woman who had once been mocked watched these generations unfold with a heart full of quiet joy. She saw her grandchildren racing through the fields, their laughter echoing just as her own had once done when she carried baskets of wildflowers. She saw in them the legacy of strength and dignity, not marked by coin or title but by the way they treated others, the way they respected the earth. She knew then that her life had become something greater than she had ever dreamed. What began as survival had blossomed into a heritage that could not be undone. The Baron aged gracefully, his once strong body now frail, but his spirit unyielding. In his final days, he often held her hand as they sat by the window, watching the land they had nurtured. "I thought I was building a fortress," he confessed one evening, his voice thin but steady. "But you showed me I was building a garden. And in that garden, we have planted more than we will ever see bloom." She pressed her lips to his hand, her eyes filled with tears that were not of sorrow but of gratitude. For in truth, she had not only given him life, he had given her a place to let her strength grow without fear. When he passed, the ranch mourned not a master but a father. And she, though her heart broke, stood tall, for she knew she carried his spirit within her. Elira and Cale stood beside her, their children at their feet, and together they promised to carry the legacy forward. She smiled through her tears, knowing the ranch was no longer dependent on any one of them. It had become larger than them all, a living testament to the power of dignity, labor, and love. In time, as her own hair turned silver and her steps slowed, she found herself walking the fields less often, but she never lost the habit of touching the soil, of speaking softly to the earth as though it were an old friend. The workers, now the children and grandchildren of those she had first walked beside, came to her for counsel, for wisdom, for the gentle strength she had always offered. And when she spoke, they listened, not because she demanded it, but because her life had proven every word. Her story, once whispered in mockery, became whispered in reverence. Mothers told their children of the girl who had been laughed at for her patched dress, who had been scorned for her poverty, but who had risen not through defiance or pride but through quiet dignity and unshakable strength. And those children carried the story forward, until it became less a tale of one woman and more a truth etched into the identity of the land itself. Long after her days, when the ranch had passed into the hands of her great-grandchildren, when the town had grown into a bustling place shaped by trade and progress, her presence remained. It lived in the way workers still gathered in unity, in the way disputes were settled with listening rather than force, in the way children were taught to see worth not in wealth but in labor and kindness. It lived in the soil, in the laughter of the cattle, in the rustle of the grasses beneath the wide, unending sky. And those who came from far away, hearing whispers of a place unlike any other, would ask how it began. And the answer was always the same. It began with a girl they mocked for being too poor, until a baron saw the truth and said, "My ranch needs a woman like you." From that moment, a world changed, not through wealth, not through power, but through the enduring strength of a woman who had nothing, and in giving everything, left behind more than anyone could measure. The fields stretched wide as ever, a sea of green and gold shifting beneath the winds, yet she knew the seasons of her life had reached their autumn. Age had carved its lines upon her face, her hands bore the marks of years of labor, and her hair had turned the silver of moonlight. But her eyes, those steady, unflinching eyes, remained unchanged. They still carried the same calm fire that once endured the laughter of a village, the same flame that had guided a baron to see what others had missed. She rose each morning slower than before, her steps measured, her breath steady but thinner. And yet she insisted on walking the land. Workers urged her to rest, her children begged her to sit, but she would smile and answer, "If the soil still carries me, then I will still carry the soil." They did not press her further, for they knew the land was as much a part of her as her own blood. The ranch had grown vast, more prosperous than the baron could have ever imagined in his youth. Elira and Kale, now with families of their own, had taken on the mantle of leadership. Elira, steady as stone, oversaw the workings of the ranch with the same unyielding dedication her mother had once shown. Kale, though still restless, had tempered his wanderlust into wisdom, bringing knowledge from distant lands to strengthen their ways. Together, they stood as twin pillars, balancing tradition and change. The grandchildren filled the halls with a vitality that reminded her of earlier days. They were loud, curious, sometimes reckless, but always bound by the lessons she had instilled in their parents: respect for the land, compassion for others, dignity that no wealth could measure. She told them stories each evening, not tales of grandeur but of truth, how seeds must first be buried before they can grow, how animals responded to gentleness more than force, how laughter could heal wounds pride could only deepen. They listened with wide eyes, though not always with patience, yet the words sank into them like rain into thirsty earth. The town beyond the ranch had transformed too. Where once narrow streets and market stalls sufficed, now larger houses and shops lined the roads. Merchants prospered, travelers stopped more often, and schools filled with children of workers and tradesmen alike. It was a different place from the one where she had once been mocked for wearing patched dresses. Yet she never walked its streets with arrogance. When people bowed their heads in respect, she inclined hers in return, for she never forgot what it felt like to be unseen. Still, prosperity carried its own challenges. With growth came greed, with abundance came envy. Families who had once laughed at her but now lived by the example she and the baron had set began to chafe under the weight of their own pride. They whispered that the ranch had too much influence, that one family should not hold so much sway. Old voices rose again, echoing the envy of Corvin, whose name by now had become little more than a warning passed from lips to children, a tale of bitterness consuming a man until he left nothing behind but ashes. Elira met these whispers with firmness, but not malice. She visited town councils, reminding them that the ranch did not hoard its wealth but shared it freely, that workers were treated as kin, not tools, that prosperity for one was prosperity for all. Kale, with his knowledge of distant towns, spoke of places where division destroyed whole communities, where envy consumed until there was nothing left to envy. Together, they kept the shadows at bay, though they knew shadows never vanished entirely. In her quiet hours, the woman thought often of the baron. She remembered his steady hand, his voice that had grown gentler with years, his eyes that had softened when they watched their children play. She felt him still in the ranch, in the oak tree under which he had loved to sit, in the laughter of grandchildren who bore his features. Grief had long since settled into something softer, less like a wound and more like a shadow that walked beside her, reminding her of love's endurance. Sometimes, at dusk, she would sit by the window and whisper as though he still listened. "It endures," she would say. "What we built still endures." Her own end approached slowly, with the dignity that had marked her entire life. She knew it, and she did not fear it. She spoke of it openly to her children, telling them that when she was gone, they must not mourn as though something had been lost. "What I am is already in you," she told Elira and Kale, and in them, she said, pointing to her grandchildren, "I have given all I had. Nothing is lost, only carried forward." The night she passed, the ranch held its breath. She had asked to be taken to the fields one last time, and her children carried her in a small cart, wrapped in blankets, her head resting against Elira's shoulder. The stars shone bright, a river of silver across the sky, and the grasses swayed gently in the breeze. She closed her eyes, her lips curved into the faintest smile, and with a final breath that was more like a sigh of peace than of departure, she slipped quietly into eternity. For days, silence cloaked the ranch. Workers wept openly. Children clung to their mothers, even the animals seemed subdued, their movements slower, their sounds muted. The town gathered, filling the fields with people who once had mocked her, once had doubted her, once had whispered against her, but now stood in reverence. They came not because she was the Baron's wife, but because she had been the steady hand that lifted them all. Merchants, farmers, teachers, workers, all spoke of how her wisdom had touched them, how her kindness had steadied them, how her dignity had inspired them. Her body was laid to rest beneath the oak tree, beside the Baron, where roots reached deep into the soil they had nurtured together. But her story did not rest there. Elira and Kale carried it forward, teaching their children as she had taught them. Workers told their children how the woman had walked the fields with them, how she had knelt to mend fences, how she had stood shoulder to shoulder in times of drought and storm. The story became not only memory but heritage. Generations unfolded, each carrying a piece of her spirit. Great-grandchildren grew who never knew her face but knew her presence in every story, in every practice, in every tradition of the ranch. They played beneath the oak tree, chasing each other around the graves of the two who had begun it all, not with fear but with joy, as though even in death, she and the Baron watched over them. The town changed too, becoming larger, its markets bustling, its streets crowded with wagons and carriages. Yet at its heart, the lesson remained. Dignity could not be bought, and true wealth was measured not in gold but in the strength of character. The story of the woman who had been mocked but had endured was told in schools, recited by elders, woven into songs sung at harvest festivals. Travelers who passed through carried the story with them, until it spread beyond the town, beyond the region, becoming a tale known far and wide. Some embellished it, turning her into a figure larger than life, a heroine draped larger than life, a heroine draped in myth. But those who lived on the ranch remembered her not as a legend but as a woman, one who laughed softly, who worked with her hands, who taught with patience, who endured without bitterness. And in truth, that was more powerful than any myth could ever be. As centuries shifted, the ranch became not merely a place but a legacy. Families who worked its fields spoke of it with pride, not because it was vast or wealthy, but because it carried the memory of a woman who had turned mockery into triumph. The oak tree grew massive, its branches reaching wide, its roots deep, a living monument to her life. Children played in its shade, lovers carved their names into its bark, elders sat beneath it to remember. It stood not only as a tree but as a symbol, that from ridicule could grow respect, from poverty could grow abundance, from one woman's quiet strength could grow a legacy unshaken by time. And still, when the wind rustled through the grasses, when the stars gleamed bright over the ranch, those who paused to listen swore they could hear it. The steady heartbeat of the land, the same rhythm she had heard all her life, whispering through the soil, carrying her presence through generations, reminding all who came after that dignity, once rooted, endures forever. The oak tree grew wider with every decade, its branches stretching outward like a canopy to shield the land that had birthed a legacy. By the time her great-grandchildren were old enough to ride the pastures on their own, the tree's trunk had grown so broad that it took a circle of children with outstretched arms to encircle it. Beneath its shade, the soil had been worn smooth by countless feet, by those who came to sit and remember, to whisper prayers, or simply to draw strength from the place where it all began. Her story had become something more than memory. It lived in the rhythm of the ranch, in the voices of workers who told their children why they rose with the sun, in the way disputes were settled not with fists but with listening, in the way no child ever went hungry if another had bread. She was no longer just the woman who had been mocked, but the one who endured. Her name, Arden, was spoken with reverence, though she herself had once carried it without thought, without grandeur. To the people, it became a symbol of what could be built when dignity was chosen over despair, when kindness stood firm against cruelty. But as the decades passed, new challenges came, as they always did. The world beyond the ranch grew restless. War erupted in neighboring lands, hunger spread where fields had been stripped bare by greed, and waves of desperate travelers came through the valley, seeking shelter, food, hope. The ranch had enough, and because it had enough, it gave. Elira's children and Kale's grandchildren opened the gates to strangers, offering food and work, as their grandmother once had taught them. Yet not everyone in the town approved. Whispers rose again. That the ranch had too much, that it could not save the world, that generosity to outsiders weakened the bonds within. It was in those days that Arden's great-granddaughter, Lyra, rose into her place. She bore the same dark eyes that had once silenced jeers in the marketplace, the same steady fire that had once steadied a baron. When merchants accused the ranch of arrogance, she went to them in person, sleeves rolled up, hands rough from labor, and reminded them that prosperity shared was prosperity multiplied. When frightened townsfolk said outsiders would take too much, she asked them if they had forgotten that Arden herself had once been treated as an outsider, unwanted, mocked. Her words cut through fear like sunlight through storm clouds, and though opposition never vanished entirely, it bent beneath the weight of her truth. The oak tree remained the heart of it all. Travelers who found shelter beneath its branches were told the story, not with grand embellishment but with quiet reverence. Children carved symbols into its bark, hearts, names, small drawings of flowers and horses, and each carving was treated not as defacement but as tribute. Generations of families carried memories of sitting beneath it, listening to the story of Arden and the Baron, and knowing that they, too, were part of the long thread of dignity woven into the soil. Kale's descendants carried stories from distant lands, but no matter how far they roamed, they returned, drawn back as if the ranch itself called them home. Some became scholars, some warriors, some healers, some merchants, but all bore the mark of the woman who had once been mocked. They carried themselves with quiet strength, their worth never tied to what they owned, but to what they gave. The centuries turned, and the town grew into a city, bustling with trade, marked by the spires of schools, temples, and markets. Yet even as cobblestones replaced dirt roads, even as wagons gave way to carriages and carriages to machines of iron, the ranch remained a place where time slowed, where the values Arden had planted endured unchanged. The oak tree still stood, larger than ever, its roots deeper, its branches now a home for countless birds. And beneath its shade, people still gathered to tell her story. It was no longer told as a tale of poverty overcome, for few remembered the sting of those days in vivid detail. Instead, it had become a story of transformation, of how one woman's dignity turned the scorn of many into the strength of generations. Her descendants had preserved her values not by chaining themselves to the past but by weaving them into each new age. When droughts came, they remembered her patience. When greed tempted, they remembered her humility. When envy whispered, they remembered her quiet fire. And so the ranch endured where others fell, not because of land or wealth alone, but because it carried a spirit that time itself could not erode. But as with all legacies, the story reached a moment where it risked being forgotten. A new generation arose that had never known hunger, never felt the sting of mockery, never fought for survival. For them, the ranch was simply a place of abundance, the oak tree merely a landmark. They grew restless with the weight of a history they did not feel. Some asked why they should cling to the memory of a woman who had lived centuries before. Others dismissed the story as old legend, fit for fireside tales but not for the struggles of a new age. It was Lyra's grandson, Tomas, who rekindled the flame. When a great famine struck distant lands and refugees poured into the valley, many in the city called for the gates to be closed, for resources to be hoarded. Fear clouded compassion, and greed sharpened its claws. Even among the ranch's own younger heirs, doubt stirred. Why should we give what we have built? Some asked. Why should we weaken ourselves for strangers? Tomas stood beneath the oak tree. The entire family gathered, workers and kin alike, and he told the story once more, not as legend, but as truth. He spoke of Arden, mocked for her patched dress, who had chosen dignity over despair, who had given when she had nothing, who had been the root of all they now enjoyed. If we close our gates, he said, then we bury her legacy. We will become the very thing she rose against. We will be Corvin, bitter and empty. And if we become that, then all of this, these fields, this wealth, this oak, means nothing. Silence followed his words, heavy, unbroken, until Lyra, gray-haired and frail, rose and placed her hand on the oak's trunk. "He speaks true," she said. "This tree grew because she endured. If we deny her lesson now, its roots will rot, and everything she gave us will wither." And so the gates were opened again. Refugees were welcomed. The ranch stretched itself thinner, but in doing so, it became richer than ever, not in coin, but in spirit. Those who were welcomed stayed, worked, and wove themselves into the life of the ranch, carrying forward Arden's legacy in ways even her blood could not. Her story no longer belonged only to her descendants. It belonged to all who lived by it. As centuries slipped into millennia, her name was spoken not only within the valley but across lands far beyond. Philosophers quoted her story as proof that dignity was the seed of prosperity. Leaders invoked her legacy when calling for unity. Artists painted her beneath the oak, her patched dress replaced not by silks but by the light of her own endurance. She had become more than a woman. She had become a truth. And yet, at the ranch, she was remembered still as a woman first. Each generation still gathered beneath the oak, still told the story in the quiet way it had always been told. Of a girl mocked for poverty, of a baron who saw what others could not, of a life that turned laughter into legacy. And every time the story was spoken, children listened with wide eyes, not because they understood every word, but because they felt its weight in their bones. The oak tree stood eternal, its roots holding the memory of her touch, its branches whispering her name in the wind. Travelers from distant lands came to see it, to sit beneath it, to feel the quiet strength that lingered there. And when they left, they carried the story with them, as countless others had, weaving it into the fabric of their own lands. In the end, the story of Arden was not about one woman, one baron, or one ranch. It was about what happens when dignity is chosen over despair, when kindness is chosen over cruelty, when love is chosen over fear. It was about the truth that even the smallest life, mocked and unseen, can carry the seed of a legacy greater than empires. Her life had begun in laughter meant to break her, but it had ended in a world forever shaped by her strength. And so, under the endless sky, where fields swayed golden and the oak tree stretched toward eternity, the story came full circle. What had begun as mockery became reverence. What had been dismissed as nothing became everything. And though the woman herself had long returned to the soil she loved, her presence endured in every breath of wind across the grasses, in every laugh of a child racing through the fields, in every hand that lifted another with dignity. Her life had been proof that true wealth is not what one owns, but what one gives. And that truth, once planted, can never die. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.